My name is Natalie Hayes, and I was 29 years old when my mother struck me in the stomach because I was pregnant before my older sister. I was 11 weeks along. One moment, I was standing beside my chair at my parents' Sunday dinner, trying to explain that Ethan and I had heard the heartbeat only a few days earlier. The next, my mother had crossed the room, seized my shoulder, and driven her fist low into my abdomen while screaming that the first grandchild was supposed to belong to my sister. I spent that night in an emergency room, watching a tiny heartbeat flicker on a monitor and discovering how violently my own hands could shake. But the punch was not the only thing that shattered my family. 20 minutes after my mother hit me, while I was still on the dining room floor and everyone around me was shouting, the doorbell rang. A woman stood on my parents' porch, carrying a weekend bag and wearing a face that looked almost exactly like mine, only 30 years older. My mother went white when she saw her. What followed exposed a secret that had been buried for more than 3 decades, led us into a courtroom, and forced me to choose between the one sentence I had waited my whole life to hear and the safety of the daughter growing inside me. The fist was brutal. What my mother later offered me in court was colder, because she knew exactly what it was worth to me. In my childhood home, every morning began with an inspection. My mother, Denise Caldwell, would stand at the bottom of the stairs, holding a mug of coffee, while my sister and I came down for school. Her eyes moved over us with quick, practiced precision, the way a jeweler studies stones before deciding which one belongs in the front display. Brooke, who was 4 years older than I was, received adjustments. My mother would retie a bow, smooth a collar, tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, or pinch a wrinkle from her skirt. It looked like tenderness from a distance. Up close, it functioned more like maintenance. I received one brief look from head to toe. Then my mother's attention moved on, and I remained in the hallway feeling like a parcel that had been weighed, stamped, and quietly marked as insufficient. There was a sunflower yellow measuring tape in our kitchen drawer. Every Sunday night, my mother wrapped it around Brooke's waist and wrote the number on a notepad shaped like a wedding cake. For years, she never measured me. As a child, I mistook that omission for freedom. I thought I was the lucky daughter, the one allowed to eat Halloween candy without a weekly audit. It took me almost 2 decades to understand the truth. You do not measure what you have already decided will never be displayed. I became fluent in my mother's moods before I learned long division. I could read the pressure in her jaw, the angle of a plate, the speed of her footsteps, and the difference between the bright laugh she used for customers and the rare, unguarded laugh that escaped her only a handful of times in my life. I learned to detect danger while it was still gathering itself. That ability later made me an excellent nurse. At home, it made me a child who entered every room already calculating how much space she was allowed to occupy. My mother made the most sense inside her bridal shop. Caldwell Bridal opened on Main Street in Corinth, Indiana, in 1998, and it was genuinely beautiful. Cream carpet softened every footstep. Gold-framed mirrors caught the light. White gowns hung beneath carefully positioned lamps, displayed less like merchandise than sacred objects. My mother had been Miss Harland County in 1986, and her sash remained framed behind the register. Brides came from 3 counties, because being dressed by Denise Caldwell still carried weight. She had exquisite taste, an exact eye, and the ability to make a nervous bride believe that one fitted seam could repair an entire life. Brooke began modeling for the store when she was 6. First came flower girl dresses and junior bridesmaid catalogs, then the sample gowns as she got older. She had my mother's face so completely that strangers often commented on it before saying anything else. They shared the same high cheekbones, wide-set green eyes, and polished smile. People treated the resemblance as charming. I eventually understood that my mother treated it as ownership. I worked in the shop too, but mostly in the back. I opened inventory boxes, organized garment bags, steamed tulle, replaced tags, and made myself useful without becoming visible. When I was 9, I crouched behind a rack of veils while Brooke turned on the pedestal in a pale dress for a customer. The woman laughed and asked my mother how she had managed to produce such a beautiful child. My mother gave her public laugh and replied, "We work at it. In this family, pretty is the rent." Everyone in the showroom laughed. I stayed very still behind the veils and performed the kind of arithmetic children do once and remember forever. If beauty was the rent, then I was already behind on my payments. I had the wrong face, and no one had explained who it belonged to. Once, after hearing another customer marvel over how much Brooke resembled our mother, I asked whose face I had. My mother looked at me for a fraction too long before saying, "Not from my side." Then, her mouth closed with the finality of a drawer being pushed shut. My father, Martin, was a pharmacist. For nearly 20 years, he chose the night shift, and I understood why long before I could have explained it. Our house at 7 in the evening was a stage directed by one person, and my father had found the only exit that did not require a confrontation. He loved us through quiet repairs and unattended offerings. A slice of pie would appear in the refrigerator with my name on a note. A broken bicycle chain would be fixed before dawn. If my mother's inspection became especially sharp, he might appear in the kitchen doorway with his keys in hand, ready for work an hour early. Sometimes his presence lowered the temperature, sometimes it did not. Either way, he eventually left. I have spent years trying to be fair to my father, but fairness and honesty are not the same. He also never placed himself between her and either of his daughters. He was present in the way furniture is present, solid and familiar, but incapable of stepping forward when the room became dangerous. There was one strange exception to his silence. When I was 12, I came downstairs after midnight for a glass of water and found him sitting alone at the kitchen table with his old green tackle box open. He was sliding an envelope into the small locking compartment. It had red and blue airmail edging and a looping handwriting I did not recognize. He saw me looking. Instead of explaining, he placed one finger against his lips. I nodded because secrecy was one of the few family traditions in which I had been fully included. I would not learn what those envelopes contained for another 17 years. I escaped the way many overlooked daughters escape. I became valuable somewhere else. I attended nursing school in Indianapolis and later joined a pediatric unit in Fort Wayne. Hospitals rewarded everything my childhood had forced me to practice. On a pediatric floor, no one cared whether my face belonged in a display window. They cared that I noticed a fever climbing at 2 in the morning, heard a change in an infant's cry from the hallway, or caught a medication discrepancy before it reached a patient. For the first time, being watchful mattered more than being watched. I met Ethan Hayes after his aging Corolla refused to start in the hospital parking lot at the end of one of my double shifts. I diagnosed a dead battery before he had finished describing the noise. While I attached the jumper cables, he asked whether I was always so calm. Ethan taught high school science. He laughed with his whole chest, asked direct questions, and kept a list on our refrigerator titled, "Things Natalie Was Right About." When he met my mother, she studied him in one swift pass and called him sweet. In Denise's vocabulary, sweet meant pleasant but lacking resale value. We married in 2023 inches, a small outdoor ceremony. My mother wore beige and reminded the photographer, within my hearing, that my dress had come off the rack because Natalie has always been practical. By then, I had 26 years of conditioning and one glass of champagne in me, so I let the remark slide past. What I remember most clearly from that day is Brooke reaching under the table during the toasts and gripping my hand. She held on too hard and too long, like someone clutching a railing in rough water. I assumed she was emotional about the wedding. I did not yet understand that the favored daughter was barely holding herself upright. By the time I was 29, Brooke was 33 and had spent 3 years trying to become pregnant. She and her husband, Lucas, had endured 4 rounds of in vitro fertilization. My mother paid for 2 of them and announced that fact during Easter dinner, as though she were unveiling a charitable sponsorship. Money from my mother was never a gift. It was a leash with a ribbon tied around it. She spoke constantly about the first Caldwell grandbaby. She pointed to the front window at family dinners and predicted that a bassinet would sit there by Christmas. She referred to Brooke's future child as the next face of the boutique. For a long time, I watched the pressure gather around my sister and felt a shameful measure of relief. The spotlight was still elsewhere. I had spent my life believing that the unmeasured daughter had at least been spared the heat. Then I saw the machinery beneath the shine. One afternoon, I drove Brooke to her fertility clinic because Lucas had a work commitment. My mother met us at the entrance. Before Brooke went inside, Denise placed both hands on her shoulders, kissed her cheek, and said with a smile, in a voice meant only for us, "Do not disappoint me again, sweetheart." Again. I sat in the waiting room with a paperback upside down in my lap and began reinterpreting our entire childhood. Brooke had never been the lucky daughter. She was the franchise. Her body had become a product launch that was running behind schedule, and our mother considered herself the principal investor. I remember thinking, with the detached clarity nursing sometimes gives you, that if another treatment failed, someone in our family was going to be hurt. I simply assumed the damage would remain inside the bright circle that had always excluded me. 8 weeks later, I took a pregnancy test in our bathroom and watched 2 pink lines appear. Ethan cried before I did. He sat down hard on the floor with his back against the tub, laughing through tears and repeating, "Okay, okay, okay," as if he were counting something too precious to trust. I stood there, holding the test while joy and threat assessment arrived together. In another family, this would have been only our baby. In mine, it was an unauthorized first grandchild growing inside the wrong daughter. We waited until after the first ultrasound to tell anyone. At 11 weeks, the heartbeat was strong, and the grainy image looked like a small gray bean. Ethan swore he could already see his chin. We also waited until after my mother's birthday because no tributary in our family was permitted to compete with the river. I planned the announcement the way I planned medication rounds, carefully, with safeguards and witnesses. We chose Sunday dinner at my parents' house because my father, Brooke, and Lucas would all be present. An audience usually made my mother more controlled. Public perception had always been the closest thing she had to a restraint. I even wrote a transition on an index card. Once the news landed, I planned to redirect attention toward Brooke by saying that we could not wait for our baby to have a cousin close in age. I anticipated coldness, tears, resentment, and a dozen polished remarks. I prepared myself for the spotlight to swing toward me with enough force to leave a bruise. I did not prepare for violence, because even after a lifetime of reading my mother's weather, there were storms I had never believed she would create. 3 hours before that dinner, while I was still deciding which cardigan made me look least visibly pregnant, Brooke called our mother from the clinic parking lot. Her fourth round had failed. I did not know about the call when Ethan and I arrived. I only knew that something in the house felt wrong before I had removed my coat. Brooke's eyes were swollen beneath freshly applied concealer. Lucas sat close enough that his arm rested along the back of her chair, not quite an embrace, more like a guardrail. My father carved the roast with unusual concentration because the task allowed him to keep his eyes lowered. My mother was radiant, which was the warning sign I had learned to fear most. Her brightness always intensified, in direct proportion to what she was suppressing. She poured wine, complimented everyone's posture, and told an elaborate story about a bride from Decatur. Each time her knife touched the plate, it landed a little too hard. Click, click, click. The sound formed a metronome for whatever was approaching. Every alarm in me was active. Beneath the table, I found Ethan's knee and squeezed. We had developed that signal specifically for dinners at my parents' house. It meant hold back, not tonight. But Ethan had carried our secret for 11 weeks. He was proud, excited, and unaware that pride can be flammable in the wrong room. My mother turned her smile toward us and said, "You two look positively lit up. What is going on over there?" Ethan's hand was already lifting his glass. His expression opened before I could stop him. "Actually, we have some news." I watched the sentence leave him with the same helplessness you feel when a glass tips beyond the edge of a counter. Brooke raised her swollen eyes. My father's carving knife stopped. My mother's face became perfectly still. "I am pregnant," I said, because the truth was already in the room, and it was mine to finish. 11 weeks. We heard the heartbeat on Tuesday. For half a second, no one breathed. Then the room broke, in an order I never expected. Brooke moved first. My sister had received confirmation of her fourth failed cycle only hours earlier. Yet she stood, came around the table, and wrapped both arms around me. Her cheek was wet against mine when she whispered, "Natalie." The words split under the weight of grief and love, both present at once and impossible to separate. I will love her for that embrace for the rest of my life. My father put down the knife and gripped the table with both hands. His eyes filled, and he looked directly at me before checking my mother's reaction. In our house, that small reversal of order was nearly a declaration. Then my mother rose from her chair. "Today?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, and that made it more dangerous. I started to explain that I had not known about Brooke's call. It was true, but she was no longer processing anything, I said. Her voice climbed, and the polished diction she had carried since her pageant years began to crack. She spoke about Brooke's 4 rounds, the 2 rounds she had paid for, the bassinet she had already imagined, and the years she had spent planning. She pointed toward my abdomen, as if I had committed an act of theft. "The first grandchild was supposed to be Brooke's," she said. "It has to be hers. The first grandchild must be hers." Then she came around the table. I will describe what happened next as plainly as I later described it for the medical record. My mother moved quickly around the table. Ethan and Lucas both began to stand, but none of us reacted fast enough because no one, including me, believed the thing we were seeing until it had already happened. Denise grabbed my left shoulder with one hand and drove her other fist low into my stomach, directly where she believed the baby was. "Get rid of it!" she screamed. It was one blow. I am careful about that detail because accuracy became the foundation of everything that followed. The punch forced the air from my lungs. I folded over the arm of the chair. The chair slid away, and I landed on my knees on my mother's dining room carpet with both arms wrapped around my middle. Above me, the room erupted. Ethan moved between us so quickly that his body seemed to become a wall. Brooke screamed, "Mom!" Lucas locked his arms around my mother from behind, while she continued lunging forward and shouting about her grandchild. Hers, hers, hers. Then my father made a sound I had never heard in all the years of their marriage. He stood and roared, "Denise, enough!" The entire room stopped. My mother remained trapped in Lucas's arms, her chest heaving and several pins loose from her hair. She stared down at me while I performed silent, frantic calculations about 11 weeks of pregnancy, pelvic protection, impact location, and everything I knew could still go wrong. For one brief second, horror crossed her face. I have replayed that expression more times than I can count. I still do not know whether she was horrified by what she had done or by the fact that everyone had seen her do it. Before I could decide, the doorbell rang. No one moved. A few seconds later, it rang again, 2 polite chimes cutting through the wreckage of the dining room. My father walked toward the front door as though he were forcing himself through deep water. When he opened it, a woman stood beneath the porch light, wearing a gray trench coat and carrying a weekend bag over one shoulder. She looked to be in her early 60s. Her silver hair was cropped short. She was tall, composed, and completely unfamiliar. Then I saw her face. Ethan's breathing changed before my mind completed the connection. The woman did not merely resemble me. She had my jaw, my wide-set eyes, the shape of my mouth, and the strong chin that had never matched anyone in our family photographs. She looked like a future version of me standing on my parents' welcome mat. From the floor, still folded over my stomach, I stared at her, as if a mirror had walked out of another decade. My mother lost all color. The woman who had ruled every room of my childhood began to shake behind Lucas's restraining arms. The stranger looked from the overturned chair to me on the carpet, then to Denise. She read the scene with one slow sweep of her eyes, using the same kind of precise assessment my mother had always used on everyone else. "Hello, Denise," she said. Her voice was low and level. "More than 30 years, and it is still the same performance." She paused, taking in my hands clamped over my abdomen. "Who gave you permission to touch that girl?" My father's voice came out hoarse. "Natalie, this is your Aunt Vivian." That was when I felt warmth beneath me and realized I was bleeding. The next 6 hours remain in my memory, with the hard edges of a chart. Ethan drove me to the emergency department in Fort Wayne, the same hospital where I had handed off pediatric patients hundreds of times. This time, I was the one in a gown, lying on a bed and watching the monitor from the patient's side. For a nurse, that position is a special kind of torture. You know enough to recognize every possible danger, and not enough to know which one is happening to you. The bleeding was light and stopped while we waited. During the ultrasound, the screen filled with layers of gray. Then, the flicker appeared. The fetal heart rate was 164 beats per minute, steady and strong. Mine was 118. I stared at that tiny pulse and felt as though the entire room had narrowed to one point of light. The obstetrician, Dr. Priya Shah, identified a small subchorionic hematoma, essentially a bruise between layers of tissue. She explained that my uterus was still positioned low behind the pelvic bone at 11 weeks, which had offered the pregnancy some protection. I needed rest, close observation, and immediate reassessment if the bleeding or pain changed. The impact had caused a bruise and a night of terror, but anatomy had protected what mattered most. I lay there counting reasons to be grateful while my hands continued to tremble. Then Dr. Shah pulled her stool closer. Her voice shifted into the calm, deliberate register clinicians use when they need the truth without frightening the patient away from it. Natalie, I need to ask how this happened. My entire upbringing had prepared me to lie in response to that question. I fell. It was an accident. Things became confused. Family matters should stay inside the family. The phrases sat ready in my mouth, polished by generations of women who had learned to preserve the household by erasing themselves. I looked at the ultrasound monitor. The heartbeat remained steady. The child inside me could not speak, and I was the only person in the world capable of protecting her truth. My mother struck me, I said. One closed fist blow to the lower abdomen at approximately 7:40 this evening. I gave the sequence without embellishment. Doctor, Shaw nodded, typed, and entered the truth into my medical record. That moment changed me. People can be pressured into retracting statements. Families can reshape memories. A clinical chart does not care whether a lie is socially convenient. My father arrived at our duplex the following morning. He stood on the front step looking like a man applying for a position he expected to be denied. Ethan let him inside, but Martin did not sit until I asked him twice. He carried a covered pan of scrambled eggs, his usual language for love, and the old green tackle box I had not seen since childhood. He placed both on our kitchen table. After working the small lock, he opened the hidden compartment. Inside were dozens of envelopes arranged in bundles and secured with rubber bands. They carried the same red and blue airmail borders and the same looping handwriting I remembered from the night I was 12. The postmarks stretched across decades, many from Santa Fe. Vivian, he said. Your mother cut her off in 1990, removed her pictures from the albums, banned her name from the house, and told everyone she had become unstable. But Vivian kept writing to me. One card every year. I opened every one and saved them. I never had the courage to answer. He turned an envelope over in his hands while he explained why she had appeared at dinner. When I called and said Ethan and I had important news for Sunday, my father sensed trouble. My mother had been increasingly volatile about Brooke's fertility treatments. He knew Vivian would be traveling through Ohio and called her without telling anyone else. He invited her to stop by for dessert because she was the only person he had ever known who could stand up to Denise and remain standing. I thought she might be insurance against an argument, he said. I planned for a storm, Natalie, not for what your mother did. His jaw tightened. Then he said the most truthful sentence I had ever heard from him. I spent years telling myself that staying quiet was holding this family together. I was not holding anything together. I was only protecting my seat at the table. Vivian came to our duplex that afternoon. Watching her pour tea in my kitchen felt deeply disorienting because I could see my own expressions moving across her face. Ethan kept glancing between us until she reached into her bag and placed a Polaroid on the table. The date written on the border was 1989. Two young women stood beside a Buick. One was my mother at 21, already poised and polished, smiling directly at the camera. She kept a visible distance between herself and the other woman. The second woman was 24, wearing a denim jacket and laughing at something outside the frame. She had my face. Not a vague family resemblance, but the same eyes, jaw, mouth, and chin that had made me feel misplaced in every childhood photograph. That is the last picture of us together, Vivian said. I was the older daughter, and according to our mother, I was the one who did not photograph well. She told me that their mother had evaluated both girls at breakfast. Posture, skin, weight, hair, expression. Vivian had been labeled the rough draft, while Denise was treated as the finished copy. At 25, Vivian left Indiana and built a pottery studio in Santa Fe. My mother told people she had gone off the rails because that story protected the family's preferred roles. Denise remained the beautiful success, while Vivian became the unstable failure who had abandoned them. What I ran was a business, Vivian said, but the truth was never useful to the performance. She slid the photograph toward me. Her expression softened without losing its strength. You have my face, Natalie. Do not accept her script for it. I picked up the Polaroid and noticed that my hands had finally stopped shaking. You might expect a woman who punched her pregnant daughter in front of 4 witnesses to withdraw in shame. My mother did the opposite. Within days, she had circulated a refined version of events through the boutique, the church network, several relatives, her hairdresser, and anyone else likely to repeat it. According to Denise, I had suffered a dizzy spell caused by the first trimester and fallen against the table. Hormones had made me confused and vindictive. Because I had always been jealous of Brooke, I was supposedly using an unfortunate accident to accuse my mother of something monstrous. The story was skillfully designed. It allowed people to pity me, while dismissing me. My great-aunt in Dayton sent a prayer hands emoji and asked me not to destroy the family over a misunderstanding. A woman I had babysat for years earlier stopped me at the grocery store, squeezed my arm, and said she was praying for my situation, pausing before the final word, as though it were something unpleasant held between kitchen tongs. In a town where my mother had sold wedding dresses for decades, her version arrived tailored. Mine was expected to stand there apologetically, still wearing its pins. I did not launch a public counterattack. I did not post photographs, start a family-wide message thread, or visit the boutique to confront her. The daughter who had spent her life in the back room knew how to work with records. I requested my complete emergency department file, including the intake notes, imaging report, obstetric assessment, and nursing documentation. I printed 3 copies. 2 went into our fireproof safe. The third went into a manila folder on the kitchen counter beside the number Dr. Shaw had quietly given me before discharge, a legal advocate who worked with families experiencing violence. Ethan wrote 2 words on the front of the folder in black marker. When ready. 9 days after the dinner, my mother arrived at our duplex without warning. She was carrying a garment bag. Through the screen door, I noticed that her hair had been repinned, and she wore her second-best pearls. She had dressed for the role of a gracious mother, extending an olive branch. A week earlier, the sight might have triggered hope. By then, the Polaroid had changed the way I saw her. Once you have watched a performance from backstage, the scenery loses its power. I brought you something, she said in the warm customer service voice she used at the boutique. She unzipped the bag and revealed a cream silk maternity dress that must have cost several $100s. You will want to look put together for whatever comes next. People are talking. You know how people are. Every sentence performed 2 jobs. The dress could be presented as generosity, while the warning reminded me that my reputation remained in her hands. She never apologized. She never used a verb that acknowledged her own action. The closest she came was a sentence I wrote down afterward, so I could never be persuaded that I had imagined it. Things became so out of hand at dinner, and I hate that for us. Things became as though the punch had been weather, as though both of us had simply been caught in the same rain. I stood inside the doorway, with one hand resting over the small curve no one else could yet see. For the first time in 29 years, I watched my mother use her technique and consciously refuse the product. I am not taking the dress, Mom. She paused. One blink, a rapid recalculation, then the warmth disappeared. I see Vivian has gotten to you, she said. She was always poison. My mother walked back to her car with her spine perfectly straight. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask whether the bleeding had returned. She did not ask about the baby. In fact, she has never asked about the baby, not once, to this day. Several nights later, Ethan found me at the kitchen table after 1 in the morning. My laptop was open beside the manila folder, and I had begun completing a petition for a protective order. I stalled at the field, asking me to describe my relationship to the respondent. I had typed 1 word, mother. The cursor blinked beside it like a monitor waiting for a rhythm to return. Ethan did not pressure me. He pulled a chair beside mine, read the form, and asked, "What do you need before you can press submit?" The answer came before I had fully understood it. I needed a witness who was not married to me and was not my father. Ethan's account could be dismissed as a husband defending his wife. My father could be described as weak, disloyal, or manipulated by Vivian. I needed someone the town considered unquestionably loyal to Denise. I needed the person everyone believed my mother loved most. That meant Brooke. The request felt cruel. My sister was grieving 4 failed fertility treatments. She had spent 33 years earning her position as the favored daughter, and that position was the closest thing she had to security. Asking her to testify meant asking her to dismantle the entire structure of her life. I closed the laptop. "I cannot ask her to burn everything down for me," I said. Ethan looked at me quietly. "Maybe stop deciding for her. Your family has done enough of that." At 1:14 in the morning, my phone lit up on the table. 3 messages from Brooke appeared one after another. "File it, Nat. I will testify. I am so tired. You have no idea how tired." The next evening, Brooke sat at our kitchen table with a cup of decaffeinated coffee she kept forgetting to drink. For the first time in our adult lives, we spoke without our mother's ranking system standing between us. I told her I had spent childhood believing she lived in sunlight. She told me she had spent it beneath a heat lamp. The Sunday night measuring sessions had never truly stopped. At 33, Brooke still heard comments about her waist in front of brides, delivered with a little laugh that made humiliation sound like hospitality. My mother had scheduled 2 of Brooke's embryo transfers around the boutique's promotional calendar because a spring trunk show required her to remain photographable. When Brooke objected, Denise reminded her who had paid for the treatment. "Do not disappoint me again," was not an isolated remark. It was a repeated command. "You always thought I was the princess," Brooke said, turning her mug slowly between her hands. "I was the mannequin." "A mannequin is not loved, Natalie. It is dressed. You got to be a person in the stockroom. I know it did not feel that way. But no one measured your body for the company." We cried quietly, without drama, because neither of us had the energy for anything larger. Then Brooke opened the manila folder. She read the emergency room summary from beginning to end, placed it back on the table, and said the sentence that closed one version of our family and began another. "She hit the wrong daughter, and she is going to call it love. She has been calling it love my entire life. I will say that to the judge, exactly that way." We filed the petition on Tuesday morning with the medical records and 3 witness statements. Ethan prepared one. Brooke prepared another. The third came from my father. Martin wrote his statement at our kitchen table in the small, exact print he used on pharmacy records. His hand shook more than his handwriting. After signing, he leaned back and said, almost to himself, 35 years married, and this is the first time I have ever testified against her." Then he aligned the pages with the edge of the table, the same way I organize documents, and added, "It should have happened 30 years ago, before all of this had time to grow." The court issued a temporary protective order that day based on the recent act of violence, the medical documentation, and the witness accounts. A full hearing would follow so both sides could be heard. The order had to be formally served, and a sheriff's deputy found my mother at the boutique on a Saturday while she was conducting a fitting. I was not there. Several people later described how she accepted the papers in front of a bride, and her family with a bright hostess smile, thanked the deputy as though he had delivered flowers, and completed the fitting without a visible mistake. People sometimes ask whether I felt victorious, knowing that the order reached her inside the kingdom she had built. I did not. When I heard, I stood in my kitchen with one hand over my abdomen and counted the facts that mattered. I was 14 weeks pregnant. The heartbeat remained strong. A legally enforceable boundary now stood where my body had previously stood alone. I had not won. I had simply stopped agreeing to lose. The town divided in quiet, small-town ways. Some relatives stopped calling. Casseroles went to one house and not the other. People shifted positions in church pews. A cousin I barely knew sent me a card with only 2 words inside. "I believe you." The sentence was underlined twice and unsigned. I placed it in the fireproof safe with the medical records. My mother hired an attorney from Indianapolis. Then, in a move so perfectly characteristic that I almost admired its precision, she placed a hand-lettered sign in the front window of Caldwell Bridal. It read, "Family is everything." I drove past it once and laughed so suddenly that I startled a dog in the next car. It was not amusement. It was the sound a body makes when irony becomes too exact to absorb quietly. A few days later, my maternal grandmother called from an assisted living facility in Ohio. She was 84, the original author of the breakfast scoring system that had shaped both of her daughters. Vivian had visited her for the first time in decades and told her what happened. My grandmother's voice was thin and uneven over the phone. "Your mother was such a beautiful girl," she began. Then she stopped. "We made sure of it. We made sure." After a long silence, she admitted that she had watched her own mother evaluate and restrict her. She had believed that was how girls were prepared to survive. She never offered a direct apology. Women in her generation often expressed remorse through food, pauses, and unfinished sentences rather than clear admissions. But before hanging up, she said, "Do not let anyone weigh that baby, except her doctor." Her voice broke on the word baby. It was the closest the assembly line had ever come to apologizing for what it produced. I was 16 weeks pregnant by then. The nausea had eased, and my waist was beginning to change. I sat with the phone in my lap and thought about how none of the women who created me had ever been allowed to inhabit a body without being graded. My daughter was not yet born, and already I knew she would never learn that language in my home. The hearing was scheduled 11 days later. My attorney, Julia Mercer, was 47, favored courthouse gray suits, and had a handshake that felt like a door closing securely. She prepared me without theatrics. We would submit the records. The witnesses would testify. The other side would be permitted to question them. I should answer only what was asked. Use sequence rather than adjectives, and resist the urge to defend every insult. At the end of our final preparation session, Julia closed the folder and removed her glasses. She told me that my mother's attorney had signaled an interest in resolving the matter before the judge ruled. Their proposed structure would likely involve my withdrawing the petition in exchange for family counseling, supervised contact, and a statement of reconciliation. She warned me that the offer would sound reasonable because courts often prefer arrangements that appear reasonable. Then she said, "It will be wrapped in the thing you want most. That is how these offers are built for daughters. Prepare yourself here, in this office. Do not wait until you are standing in that room." "What do I want most?" I asked. I meant the question sincerely, which showed how thoroughly I had buried the answer. Julia studied me with the patient expression of a clinician waiting for someone to read her own chart. That night, I sat on our bed holding the Polaroid. I had begun carrying it with me the way some people carry a religious medal. I studied Vivian laughing beside the Buick in 1989 and my mother standing several inches away, posed and composed even at 21. For the first time, I noticed how alone Denise looked inside her perfection. Then, I said the answer aloud to the empty room. I wanted my mother to tell me she loved me. 29 years. One sentence. Somewhere in Indianapolis, her lawyer was preparing to place that sentence inside a settlement offer. The night before the hearing, my mother violated the temporary order by coming to our porch. Legally, I should have reported her immediately. Julia later told me she had expected me to, but she did not shame me for hesitating. When I looked through the screen door, I saw my mother, without her usual armor. No pearls, no carefully secured hair. Her cardigan was buttoned incorrectly at the bottom, which for Denise was the visual equivalent of a scream. "2 minutes," she said. "I will stay out here." I kept the door closed between us. Under the porch light, my mother told me the first completely honest thing I had ever heard her say about herself. "My mother weighed me every Monday morning," she said, staring at the porch railing. "Before school, before breakfast, the number decided what kind of week I was allowed to have. When I was 15, before the county final, she locked the kitchen for 3 days. 3 days, Natalie." I competed dizzy. I won. She explained that her mother framed the sash and hung it beside the kitchen key. I stood inside, with one hand over my 16-week curve, and felt grief rise for the starving girl my mother had once been. Her wound was real. It explained the origin of the system, and for a moment my entire chest ached for her. Then, in the same breath, she tried to spend that truth. So you understand that I do not mean the things that happen when I am wound tight, she said. Withdraw the petition tomorrow. We will do counseling. We will agree to whatever supervision they want. And I will say it, Natalie. I will tell you I love you. I have never said it to anyone. Not your father, not Brooke. You would be the first. There it was. The sentence I had waited my whole life to hear, quoted to me in advance like a purchase price. Good night, Mom, I said. I will see you in court. I closed the door, sat down against it, and cried because I had come terrifyingly close to opening it. The hearing began at 8:40 the next morning in Allen County Superior Court. The room smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Our side of the gallery filled in a way I had not allowed myself to imagine. Ethan wore the tie he reserved for funerals and job interviews. My father sat very straight in his church suit, his signed statement folded in his breast pocket like a passport he feared someone might confiscate. Brooke wore a plain navy dress, so deliberately unadorned that I knew the choice was a declaration. The mannequin had come off duty. Vivian had flown back from Santa Fe on 9 days' notice. She sat on the aisle with her cropped silver hair and my face, calm in the way of someone who had waited more than 3 decades for a room where the family story could no longer be edited by one person. My mother entered 10 minutes later with her attorney. She wore a deep green suit she usually saved for meetings with the bank. Her chin was lifted, her posture flawless, and at 58, she remained the kind of woman a room noticed. She assessed the gallery in one swift pass. Her eyes caught on Vivian, and her step faltered for less than a second. Then her chin rose another degree to conceal whatever had moved beneath it. She did not look at me. The bailiff called the case. Hearing my name and my mother's connected by the word verses felt unreal, as though the court had welded together two facts my childhood had taught me could never coexist. She was my mother, and I was permitted to oppose her. The judge, a brisk, gray-haired woman with reading glasses on a chain, opened the file and began. The evidence was presented without ornament, and its dryness made it devastating. The intake note, ultrasound findings, obstetric assessment, and nursing documentation were displayed and entered into the record. One sentence carried more force than every rumor my mother had circulated. The patient reported being struck in the abdomen by her mother with a closed fist. No metaphor, no family history, no adjective that could be challenged. Just an event, a body, and a record created before anyone had time to tailor the story. Ethan testified first. He was steady, visibly shaken. He described where everyone had been seated, how my mother crossed the room, the position of her hand, the words she shouted, and what happened afterward. He did not speculate about motives. He did not exaggerate. He simply described what he saw. In that county, people knew her as the face of the boutique and the daughter closest to Denise. She folded her hands in her lap and spoke in an even voice. My mother did not lose control because Natalie had something that should have belonged to me, she said. She lost control because she believed everything about me belonged to her. I know what that feels like. I have been hers for 33 years. She paused, then delivered the sentence she had promised at my kitchen table. She hit the wrong daughter, and she is going to call it love. She has been calling it love my whole life. My mother's attorney asked only a few questions. There was little advantage in attacking the witness everyone regarded as Denise's chosen daughter. During the recess, my mother's attorney approached Julia with the expected offer. I would withdraw the petition. In return, my mother would agree to structured counseling, supervised contact, and a personal statement of reconciliation delivered to me in court and placed on the record. Julia repeated the terms in the hallway while watching my face. A personal statement, I said. You know what it will be, she replied. Make the decision here. We declined. When the hearing resumed, Julia called Vivian. My aunt had not witnessed the punch, and she said so immediately. Her role was to explain the family pattern that gave context to my mother's behavior and to the risk of future contact. The judge allowed a limited account. Vivian spoke slowly, without anger, and without losing her place. She described the breakfast evaluations, the posture corrections, the comments about skin and weight, and the way their mother let her coffee go cold because scoring her daughters mattered more than drinking it. She described the photographs removed from albums because certain faces did not support the family image. She told the court how girls in their house had been treated as inventory. Then she described the year Denise was 15. Before the county pageant final, their mother locked the kitchen for 3 days so Denise would fit into the dress. My mother competed hungry, dizzy, and desperate. She won. Their mother hung the sash beside the kitchen key, making the reward and the deprivation part of the same display. In our family, pretty is the rent, Vivian said. That phrase belonged to our mother before Denise repeated it. My sister was the first successful product of that system. I was the one who escaped it. For the first time, Vivian's voice bent. She looked directly at Denise. I am not here because I hate my sister. I am here because I know what she was taught to do to girls, and I know what she will do to Natalie's child if no one stops the pattern. It is the only form of love she was ever shown. I watched my mother during that testimony. Her back remained straight, and her eyes shone without releasing a tear. In the middle of hearing her life dissected, she tilted her head slightly and checked her reflection in the glass surface of the table. That single movement contained everything I had struggled to understand. The starving 15-year-old was real. So was the woman who had become the scale. I could grieve for the first without surrendering my daughter to the second. Before ruling, the judge asked whether my mother wished to make a statement. Her attorney began to respond, but Denise interrupted him. She stood, smoothed the front of her green suit, and turned toward me instead of the bench. The courtroom became so quiet that I could hear the ceiling fan clicking overhead. Natalie, she said. Her voice caught. I had studied that voice all my life, and beneath the practiced control I heard something real struggling to surface. I love you, Natalie. I have never said it because, where I come from, people did not get to say those things. I do love you. The sentence entered the room in front of her husband, her sister, both daughters, a judge, and a court reporter. It was the sentence I had wanted before I even knew how to name wanting. For a moment, my mother stood at the edge of the truth. Then she stepped backward into the only structure she trusted. So withdraw this order, sweetheart, she continued. Come home. We will be a family again. You can have everything you ever wanted. All you have to do is take it back. The Polaroid rested in the inside pocket of my blazer, over my heart, where I usually kept a penlight. My daughter moved inside me, one of the first clear flutters I had felt. I was 17 weeks pregnant, and the timing felt almost unbearable, as though she had turned in her sleep to listen. The judge looked at me. Miss Hayes? I stood with one hand over the curve of my abdomen. I spoke quietly because I had finally learned that quiet was the one volume my mother could not perform over. I believe you, Mom. Her face lifted. For one terrible second, it became radiant with victory. Then I continued. That is the saddest part of this room. I believe that you love me today, here, while that love can purchase something you need. That is the only kind of love your mother taught you. Love with a receipt. You are offering me the sentence I have wanted for 29 years, and you are offering it as a price. I will not buy my safety with it, because my daughter is listening. Love is not rent. No one owes you for the face they were born with. Then I turned to the judge and asked the court to issue the protective order. The judge granted it for 2 years. She delivered the findings in 4 measured sentences and made the order effective immediately. The gavel sounded lighter than it does on television. My mother collected her handbag, rose, and walked out at the same controlled pace she used for every public exit. Her heels struck the tile in perfect rhythm. Click, click, click. It was the same metronome I had heard against dinner plates throughout childhood. She did not look at my father. She did not look at Brooke. She did not look at Vivian, or me. The doors closed behind her, and that is the last sound of my mother I have heard. After the doors shut, I sat down because my legs finally began to shake. I let them. The person they had been holding upright all morning was pregnant, exhausted, and carrying a child who already had my chin. I had just refused the only sentence I had ever wanted, because accepting it would have taught my daughter that safety could be traded for affection. It did not feel like victory. It felt like an amputation performed to save the rest of the body. Painful, necessary, and final. In the hallway, the family that had chosen to stand with me gathered beneath the fluorescent lights. My father hugged me first. With my face against his church suit, I realized I could not remember the last time he had initiated an embrace. His statement remained folded in his breast pocket because the records and earlier testimony had been enough, but he kept touching the pocket as if confirming that he still possessed proof of his own courage. 30 years late, he whispered into my hair. I know, Nat, I know. Brooke waited until I reached for her. Then she gripped my hand with the same fierce pressure she had used at my wedding, the grip I had once mistaken for sentimentality. This time, I understood it as a person holding on to the only railing available. I held just as tightly. I suppose I have to learn how to be a sister now, she said through tears. I hear it is like being a mannequin, except you are allowed to move. Vivian placed the Polaroid in my hand and closed my fingers around it. Keep it somewhere you will see it, she told me. Not so you remember what Denise did. Keep it so you remember where the script ends. It ends with the first person who refuses the part. Ethan drove us home with one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting on my knee. Neither of us spoke. After a lifetime in which silence meant fear, secrecy, or surrender, that quiet felt clean. My daughter was born in November, 2 days after her due date. She weighed exactly 7 pounds, announced herself with the volume of a fire alarm, and was completely healthy. The hematoma had resolved by the 20th week, just as the doctors predicted. Although I never stopped checking every scan and every movement, with the vigilance of both a mother and a nurse, the hospital waiting room held the family we had chosen through action, rather than title. Ethan's parents were there. My father arrived with gas station flowers he had clearly selected in a panic. Brooke brought a balloon and guarded news of her own. A fifth fertility cycle, paid for by her and Lucas, scheduled around their lives rather than the boutique's calendar, had reached 9 weeks and was progressing normally. Vivian could not fly from Santa Fe until Christmas, so she joined by video from her pottery studio and cried beside a warm kiln. There was no symbolic empty chair for my mother. We did not set one. Denise learned about the birth through the same town network she had always used. A package arrived through Brooke from the boutique. Inside was an exquisite white silk newborn gown worth at least $200. The enclosed card contained no apology and no acknowledgement. It said only, "Blessings, Denise." I held the dress for a long time. It was delicate, beautiful, and heavy, with 3 generations of expectation. Then I took it to the hospital charity closet. It would clothe a baby whose family needed it, without requiring that child to become anyone's display. Caldwell Bridal continues to thrive. The family is everything sign remains in the window. Brides still travel from surrounding counties to be fitted by my mother, and people still describe her as elegant. They are not entirely wrong. The machine is polished, illuminated, and operating on Main Street. It simply does not run through my home anymore. 2 photographs now hang on our refrigerator beneath a magnet shaped like a slice of pie. One is my daughter's sonogram. The other is the Polaroid from 1989. My daughter will grow up knowing the stories of both women in that photograph, but only one of them is allowed to hold her. A year after the hearing, I understand that some people must grieve a mother who is still alive. Breaking a cycle does not always feel triumphant. Most days, it feels like making one ordinary decision after another. Refusing the dress, saving the record, believing the witness, closing the door, and choosing your child's face over your mother's mirror. My daughter has my chin, which means she also has Vivian's. I hope she keeps it exactly as it is. No one in this house will ever measure its worth.